Welcome to, I'll start again. Uh, Welcome everyone, Erev Tov, and thank you very much for signing on to hear Fred Rosenbaum give a talk about the film Love Gets a Room. Before I introduce Fred, I'd like to talk about our July program, which we're going to do in person at Congregation B'nai Shalom in Walnut Creek. The film that we're going to see then is The Road to Recovery, a film that deals with the October 2023 war. And one of the directors, it's co-directed with another person. One of the directors is coming from Israel and will be with us on July 20th, a Sunday evening at 6:30 p.m. So again, we will introduce the film repeatedly this month and next month so that if you want to come, you can sign up for the in-person screening, The Road to Recovery. Well, now a little bit about Fred Rosenbaum, one of our most popular speakers. Noted speaker Fred Rosenbaum is an American author, historian, and adult educator. He founded and directed Lehrhaus Judaica, described as, quote, the largest Jewish adult education center in the Western United States, unquote. Today, Lehrhaus has continued as New Lehrhaus and continues to provide meaningful courses and lectures. Fred grew up in Queens, New York, and earned a bachelor's degree at Washington University in St. Louis. Subsequently, he studied history of the Nazi regime as a Fulbright scholar in West Germany. He then earned a master's degree in European history at the University of California at Berkeley. An award-winning historian and writer, he has written numerous books and co-authored several memoirs of Jewish partisans. Fred has also been traveling as a scholar for at least, I think it is, 25 study tours throughout the world. And one of his next tours will be to India. And details can be found at Tiyul Jewish Journeys. Tiyul is spelled Tiyul, Jewish Journeys. And now, very happy to introduce Fred Rosenbaum. Thank you, Fred.
Okay, thank you, Riva, for that nice introduction, and thank you, Gabor, for helping on the tech side. I really appreciate the arrangements and this opportunity. So, this is a film about life under extreme conditions, about love under extreme conditions, set inside the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto in January 1942, where almost 500,000 people crammed into an area of barely 1 square mile faced famine, frigid temperatures, infectious diseases, and Nazi brutality. Half a year later, the liquidation of the ghetto would begin. And during that summer, mid 42, more than 80% of the inmates would be transported to Treblinka and gassed to death there. The heroic Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would occur only the following year, in April 1943, when only a small remnant of Jews remained. So Love Gets a Room, then, takes place in an earlier period, not that of systematic extermination, which could not yet be imagined, but a period of deprivation so severe that the gradual death of the community is looming. Amidst this impending demise, a love triangle unfolds, revolving around the dramatic device known as a play within a play. The film's main characters, who suddenly face an agonizing life or or death choice are simultaneously actors in a romantic comedy that they perform that very night. This theatrical technique has, of course, been used to great effect over the centuries by Shakespeare, for example. The inner drama can have various functions, can influence or expose one of the main characters. Think of Hamlet famously saying, "The play's the thing where I'll catch the conscience of the king." Now, in Love Gets a Room, the story within the story seems to me both a mirror and a lens. A mirror in that it too is set in the Warsaw Ghetto, the awful conditions of which throw lovers into disarray. Due to the severe overcrowding, two newly married couples and later a third are forced to live in a single room. The dialogue reflects that and the meager food rations, the callous and corrupt Jewish bureaucrats, the lack of heat, electricity, and running water. The name of the play, Love Searches for an Apartment, is similar to the film's title, right? Love Gets a Room. Remarkably, the names of the main characters are the same as well. They are called Stefsha, Edmund, and Patrick on stage and off. And Stefsha and Edmund embrace with no less passion when they're playing their parts than when they're in private. As the film's director, Rodrigo Cortez, puts it, the actors' lives behind the stage bleed into their performance on it. At times it's hard to separate the show from real life. In the play, the man in one couple is a former lover of the woman in the other couple. Well, off stage too, Patrick is the former lover of Stefsha, and Edmund her current one. But the play within the movie is also a particular lens, actually rose-colored glasses. By that I mean it's a way to view the plight of Warsaw's Jews as a light-hearted evening of satire, humor, and music, poking fun at the absurdity of the situation while blurring the true depths of the suffering. This was a much needed distraction for people in torment day and night. Also, a way for artists to perform, to remain in touch with their life work, even in these appalling circumstances, was a brief interlude of normalcy for the actors and the audience alike. With tickets cheaper than bread, the theater was just about the only affordable luxury. We see its almost unbelievably transcendent power near the end. Even when the Nazis interrupt the performance and murder a musician, the crowd gasps at the atrocity, but the show must go on. And then the play's finale is so rousing and upbeat that it gets a joyous standing ovation. This is minutes after the audience witnesses a killing. Now, there were 5 theaters in the Warsaw Ghetto until the mass deportation of mid-1942 that I mentioned. The largest of these was the Femina, seating 900 in a cavernous former movie house on a lively street. Let's look at the first image, Gabor. Now, the artistic director of Femina was the talented young dramatist and lyricist Jerzy Urandat, who you see on the right. That fall, he of the fall of 41, he premiered his own play, Love Searches for an Apartment, an immensely successful, long-running production. And it featured some of the city's leading actors. The lines that you hear in that play are unchanged from his original Polish script, which was found after the war in the hidden milk cans of the devoted archivist of the ghetto, Emanuel Ringelblum. And I'll discuss him in more detail later. Unearthed with the play's dialogue were the lyrics to the songs. Although the musical score was lost, that was composed for the recent film. In the role of Stefsha, Urandat cast his wife, Stefsha, that is, Stefania Grojenska, a versatile singer, dancer, humorist. She starred in several plays at the Femina. She was also a poet, as we'll see. In any case, this photo, I believe, captures her magnetism. Now, both of them, well connected before the war, were later able to escape the ghetto and survive. They returned to Warsaw to continue their notable careers. Grojenska, as you see, lived to 2010 and to the age of 95. Urandat died in 1979, but he is given credit as the co-author of the 2021 movie screenplay of the film that you watched. Because the inner drama that he wrote 80 years earlier is such an important part of the film. But how did this movie come about? Could you scroll down, please, Gabor? In 2019, the German Jewish author David Zafir read the play that had delighted the Warsaw Ghetto audiences, and he was taken by it. He wrote the first draft of a novel imagining the personal lives of the cast members. Zafir presented it to the Spanish director Rodrigo Cortés, who agreed to make it into a movie even before the book was finished. It will be released later this month in German. The two collaborated on the script, and it was filmed in an old theater in Barcelona, featuring a cast largely of newcomers who had to be gifted singers as well as actors. The fabric of the film has a somewhat classical feel to it, and the director, Cortés, said that he was influenced by the work in the 1940s of Billy Wilder and Orson Welles. Okay, we can remove that now. Let's take a closer look at Warsaw Jewry. Before the war, Polish capital was home to the largest Jewish community in the world after New York, and the most vibrant Jewish community in the world, with a multitude of grand synagogues and small shuls and vast libraries, countless yeshivas, A wide array of Yiddish publishing houses, newspapers, and theaters. We think of New York as a city where Jews have a high profile. Today, they comprise about 12% of the five boroughs. At its peak in the 1940s, before the move to the suburbs, almost a quarter of the Big Apple was Jewish. While Warsaw, before the war, was more than 30% Jewish. Even though there were strict quotas at universities and professional schools, Jews constituted the majority of the lawyers and physicians in the city, as well as most of its artists, intellectuals, and business leaders. Let's look at the next slide. This is a Reform synagogue in the heart of Warsaw. Look at the scale of this. And 1878 is when it was constructed. This synagogue, when it opened, was the largest in the world. Now, this dynamic community, though, was divided into competing and conflicting factions. Let's look at the next, scroll down to the next image, please. There were high-powered intellectuals, many of them female, embracing controversial ideas about women's rights and social equality. There were Hasidic sects that feuded among themselves, combative Zionists of all stripes, and zealous Yiddishists and socialist Bundists. And the photo below is that of a demonstration of the Labor Bund, which had the largest number of supporters in the Jewish community. They were socialists, they were Yiddishists, and they were for Jews remaining in Poland but having autonomy in Poland. Okay, we can remove that now. Okay, the film highlights yet another group, the assimilationist Jews. They were 15% of the population across the country and a larger proportion than that in cities, the big cities like Warsaw and Krakow. They proudly considered themselves Poles and consciously moved away from their Jewish origins. Of course, there is a spectrum here. At one end, they spoke Polish rather than Yiddish. They had secular rather than Jewish education, and they changed their names. Playwright Jerzy Urandat, who I just mentioned before, he changed his last name from Gleichgewicht. But some went much further and converted to Catholicism. Assimilationists comprised most of the cast and the audience of the Femina Theater. And that's why in the movie, with one or two exceptions, few in the cast seem to have the stereotypical looks or mannerisms we might expect of Polish Jews in the 1940s. In fact, most of the film's actors cast by Cortez are Irish or British. The ghetto play was performed in Polish, and although there are a handful of Yiddish words spoken and sung, these were for local color and nostalgia. Of course, when the Nazis invaded and occupied Poland in 1939, they gave no thought to religious or cultural orientation. All that counted for them was race. Were your parents or even grandparents Jewish? So even practicing Christians, if they had Jewish descent, were subject to severe anti-Semitic decrees, which the Germans quickly imposed on Poland, with their occupation in September 39. The yellow stars, the curfew, the ban on public places such as parks. And these assimilated Jews, including the converts among them, were confined in the ghetto, which was sealed in November 1940, a little over a year into the German occupation. In the film, when one of the actors mentions that his family has not been Jewish for generations, another replies with a bitter quip that the 11th commandment is, "Thou shalt choose one's grandparents carefully." In fact, in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were roughly 12,000 converts and two Catholic churches to serve them. Now, the large majority of assimilated Jews had not changed their religion. It's just that they had ambivalent and often indifferent attitude toward their Jewish heritage. Yet under Nazi occupation, their ancestry became the most important determinant in their lives. Now, ghettoization could not have come as a complete surprise to the Jews of Warsaw. The Lodz ghetto incarcerated the country's second largest Jewish community, 175,000, as early as February 1940, 10 months before theirs. That spring, construction of the Warsaw ghetto began. 10-foot high brick walls topped by barbed wire, enclosing only 2.5% of the city's land area, which had been a relatively impoverished Jewish quarter. Thousands of non-Jews were evicted, and then a tidal wave of Jews from other parts of Warsaw and environs, and even from distant cities, were forced in. These refugees, unemployed, needing shelter, able to bring but a few possessions, were even more distressed than those who had already been living in this neighborhood. With 500,000 people, it had to be one of the most overcrowded places on earth. In the best of times, the housing stock of this small district would have been woefully inadequate for such a multitude. But now the situation was even worse because so many buildings had been destroyed by the Luftwaffe bombing during the attack against Poland the year before. So there was an average of 8 people per room. Nor were there any open public spaces like parks or playgrounds in the ghetto, which also lacked more than a handful of trees. The situation regarding nutrition was even worse. The rations allowed by the Nazis were only a fifth of those for German citizens. Just a few hundred calories a day, mostly bread, potatoes, ersatz fat, and a quarter pound of meat a week, usually horse meat. Jewish organizations which ran soup kitchens received help from abroad, but this aid was far from sufficient and abruptly ended when the United States entered the war in December 1941. The only way the ghetto could survive was through food and other necessities being smuggled in at great risk and sold on the black market, much of it at prices out of reach for a largely destitute population. Famine raged. And in the 20 months of the ghetto's existence, before the Great Deportation, about 5,000 people died of hunger every month. Yes, almost 100,000 starved to death, their friends and relatives powerless to help them. Many of them had been living on the street, and their bodies just lay there in total violation of Jewish law and custom because their families had no money for a funeral. This is depicted graphically in the film, in the ghastly opening sequence as Stefsha rushes through the ghetto on her way to the theater. We see someone taking a belt off the pants of a corpse. Often, those still alive went through the pockets of the dead for ration cards. Now, many others, malnourished to begin with, froze to death, their bodies too lying on the street. The film is set in the second winter of the ghetto, with temperatures in January frequently hovering around 0 Fahrenheit. You know, Warsaw is at a higher latitude than Calgary, Alberta. And as if the bitter cold and the lack of heating fuel weren't cruel enough, at the end of 1941, just before the film is set, the Germans demanded that the Jews surrender their fur coats for no compensation under the penalty of death. The Femina Theater was unheated, of course, and we see the audience shivering in their seats. One member of the orchestra later recalled that while he was playing, he was chilled to the bone and trembling. And the dim lighting made it hard to read the musical notes. Let's look at the next image, please. Yeah, we can go on to the next one, please. One of the most penetrating diaries of the Warsaw Ghetto is that of Chaim Kaplan, a staunch Zionist who wrote neither in Yiddish nor Polish, but in elegant Hebrew. He would be killed in Treblinka, but was able to get his journal out of the ghetto. Now, here is an entry from January 1942, the month in which the film is set. Now, there are many photos I could show you of emaciated beggars. I'll let just this one on the cover of Chaim Kaplan's book suffice. Now, let me read his entry. It is not uncommon on a winter morning to see the bodies of those who have died on the sidewalks of cold and starvation during the night. Many God-fearing souls who, if the day happens to be the Sabbath, are carrying the tallis under their arms, walk by the corpses unmoved by the sight. Nazism has maimed the soul even more than the body. Okay, can remove that. Now, unsurprisingly, disease ravaged the ghetto. Tuberculosis, and even more so, typhus, an insect-borne epidemic that killed about 20,000 Jews and sickened 5 times that number. Extraordinary measures taken by the ghetto dwellers themselves, among whom were several public health experts, halted its spread, at least before that devastating winter of 1941-42. Now, beyond all this, Jews were increasingly apprehended on the streets by German soldiers or Jewish police armed with clubs and beaten and sometimes killed for infractions such as distributing dissident literature, a shooting we see in the film. In 1942, the famous actress playing Stefsha, right, Stefania Grojenska, in Love Searches for an Apartment, she wrote a poem about a child smuggler. Let's look at that. Let's look at the next image. Now, the photo is from the Warsaw Ghetto. A German soldier accosting this Jewish kid. And here is Grojenska's poem. Again, written the year in which the play was presented. He was oh so scared to go to work each day, but he was 12. Shouldn't give in to his dread. Hirsch was a smuggler, had to make his way. Beyond the wire, he had to go for bread. You lift the barbed wire, you wriggle underneath, your armband's off, and you can barely breathe. Hirsch is so scared. He really isn't bold. He goes because they must, because they're poor. They have to eat. All their stuff's been sold. Even the beds, they now sleep on the floor. In the war, the Lord has bigger things to do. The ghetto has no direct line to God. The sentry at the wire just did his job. Neither Bread nor Hirsch would get back through. Okay, you can remove that. Many of the 50,000 children in the ghetto were completely on their own, living on the streets. Their starving bodies, anguished faces, ever present. Now, there were crime rings in the ghetto, Jewish leeches, Chaim Kaplan called them, who thrived on smuggling and black marketing. Other gangsters operated brothels filled with desperate women. And you recall in the film, a member of the play's cast urges Stefsha to earn more money by working as a high-class prostitute. The pimps and others who grew rich off the misery of other Jews, they enjoyed themselves in cabarets and restaurants that the masses could only dream about. The few with money in their pockets also included informers, and the shady older actor suggests that route too for Stefsha, that she can turn in her fellow performer Nusia, a member of the underground. But the most frequent object of scorn for virtually every diarist and memoirist was the Judenrat, the Jewish council, which administered the ghetto for the Germans. They received much better food and housing than the others, and their Jewish police force showed little mercy when it came to enforcing the draconian regulations. In the play, Edmund goes off script to ridicule them. Other cast members fear that he or even the entire production will be punished for it. Head of the Judenrat, Adam Chernyakov, whom Edmund chides as well, he was a weak leader. On the eve of the Great Deportation, he will commit suicide. Now, given all of this, you can understand how Patrick, Stefsha's former lover, can declare that if she remains in the ghetto, she will die. To repeat, Treblinka could not yet be conceived. Diarists, not even pessimists like Kaplan, diarists would not even record rumors of outright extermination for another few months. And even then, such talk was met with disbelief. Nevertheless, a sense of doom prevailed, with conditions worsening day by day. Survival seemed less and less likely. No, the Soviet Union was in the war. The United States had just entered the war. Most Jews in the ghetto thought the Allies would win, but that they wouldn't live to see that victory. But this ghetto was relatively porous, especially compared with Lodz, which was sealed almost hermetically. People could escape the Warsaw Ghetto, and tens of thousands did, largely through the sewer system. Lodz lacked even that. Others bribed the guards, the Jewish, Polish, even German sentries. Of course, it was extremely dangerous outside the ghetto, especially for those identifiable as Jews. One leading historian describes anti-Semitic Poland at this time as eagerly engaging in a Jew hunt, to catch Jews and turn them over to the Germans for a ransom. To be sure, though, there were also many thousands of righteous Gentiles, clergy among them, Catholic clergy, who hid the fugitives. Still, without money, false IDs, any guarantee of a refuge, with escape carrying a death penalty, the vast majority of Warsaw's Jews remained in the ghetto, including most of the assimilated, even though they had a better chance of passing on the outside. But what stands out amidst the hunger and disease that I've been describing, the bondage and brutality, what stands out is the self-reliance of people struggling not only to survive, but to retain their humanity. Grassroots organizations were formed, house committees for apartment blocks, as well as ghetto-wide social service operations that were independent of the deceitful Judenrat. Now, certainly, communal efforts were hampered by the pitiful shortage of food, clothing, and medicine. Although the soup kitchens were subsidized, they were not free, and many could not afford even the discounted price. And then there were the ideological quarrels among the organization's doctrinaire leaders. That sometimes caused dysfunction as well. But even while some wallowed in despair, and others, like Kaplan, accentuated the cold-heartedness he witnessed. Recall, people just passing bodies on the street. With all of that, the scale and scope of collective action, collective response to this abomination, it's really impressive. Education was banned in the ghetto, so countless clandestine study groups were held, religious and secular, for people of all ages. Lending libraries sprang up. Strict censorship was imposed, so dozens of underground publications were circulated, covering the entire Jewish political landscape. And we see reference to covert printing presses in the film, in particular that of Hashomer HaTzair, a spirited socialist Zionist youth group. Let's look at the next slide, please. Everyday life in the ghetto was documented in real time, not only by keen diarists, but also by an extraordinary group directed by the historian Emanuel Ringelblum, whom you see here. Their secret archive, Oneg Shabbat, or Joy of Shabbat, focused on the struggles of common people. It included photographs, works of art and literature, like a copy of the play Love Searches for an Apartment. It included posters and dissident leaflets and children's drawings, even candy wrappers, as well as chronicles and diaries. Ringelblum knew that so often murdered groups were known by what their killers said about them, such as the libel that the unsanitary habits of Jews caused the typhus epidemic, which justified their ghettoization. He didn't want the Germans to have the last word. Here's just one of his quotes. It must all be recorded with not a single fact omitted. And when the time comes, as it surely will, let the world read and know what the murderers have done. He was an idealist. He thought that once the archive was opened, it could deter future acts of genocide. Otherwise, such monstrous crimes would inevitably happen again. So he hoped, I quote, he hoped to cast a stone under the wheels of history. That is, to stop the inevitable recurrence of genocide. If people could truly know the depths of what had happened. As the deportations began, Ringelblum and his wife and young son escaped the ghetto, but were later caught and killed, all three of them. Now, on the eve of his departure, the archive was split into several parts and hidden underground. Only a handful of people were told of its various locations. 1946, the first trove was discovered in metal boxes under rubble, and you see that on the lower left. In 1950, the famous milk cans turned up, holding much more of this invaluable source. By the way, a third cache exists that has still not been found. Many believe it's buried under the Chinese embassy, built around 1960. They have allowed the grounds to be searched, but not permitted excavations under the floors of their compound. Okay, can you scroll down, please, to the next one? Now, parts of the archive were concealed by an artist, close collaborator of Ringelblum, Gela Zechstein, who hid during the deportations, but she was killed in the uprising the next year. Her work, this watercolor is one example of it, captures the suffering of the ghetto, but also her fervent wish that it not be in vain. And here is her last will and testament written in 43, toward the end of the uprising. I must perish, but I've done my share. I'm trying to preserve some trace of my works. Farewell, friends and comrades. Farewell, Jewish people. Don't allow such ruin to recur. Let's scroll down. And there you see her, the way she looked right before the war on the left. And then she drew her own self-portrait uh, about almost 2 years into the ghetto in 1942. Okay, we can remove that. Even more robust than fine arts was performance art. Most of it supported not by the Judenrat, but rather by the alternative agency outside it that I mentioned earlier. This was called Alleenhilfe, self-help in Yiddish, which Ringelblum was also a leader in. There was a symphony orchestra in the ghetto, including some world-famous musicians. They performed over 50 concerts during a 15-month period. Let's look at the next slide, please. One diarist rapped rhapsodic over a performance of Tchaikovsky's Pathétique, and then added this. An 18-year-old girl sang Ave Maria by Schubert. She had a strong, clear voice that seemed to burst through the walls of the hall and rise high above our world with all its daily troubles. The audience cried. I cried myself. Maria Eisenstadt did not survive the war. Neither did the conductor. They both died in Treblinka in the summer of 1942. Eisenstadt, you see here, was a lyric soprano, and she was commonly referred to as the nightingale of the ghetto. Okay, can remove that. The ghetto's musician best known today is Władysław Szpilman because of the award-winning 2002 biopic, The Pianist, with Adrian Brody, in the title role. But he did not perform in concert halls, rather in upscale cafes that were patronized mostly by the Judenrat and other elites. Now, in terms of entertainment for the masses, no art form matched the vigor of the theater. And that lasted from the time the ghetto was sealed all the way to the deportation. The 5 stages hosted thousands of performances, including 58 different shows. Together, they had 4,000 seats, 80% of which were filled on average, and sellouts were common. These playhouses catered to every taste, and not all of it was high quality. The Yiddish theaters often churned out vaudeville skits with silly burlesque and slapstick gags. The term for this clownish comedy in Yiddish was Schund, meaning trash. It was sharply criticized as vulgar by some of the best minds in the ghetto, such as socialist Zionists like Emanuel Ringelblum, who advocated a repertory conveying a political message. He wanted plays elevating the working class, such as those by American leftists like Lillian Hellman or Clifford Odets. But this was a rare instance of the social historian Ringelblum being out of touch with the needs and desires of ordinary folk. The farcical routines continued to be performed in front of enthusiastic audiences. Sometimes these same theaters did present world-class dramas, such as Shakespeare and Molière in Yiddish. The 3 Polish language theaters typically offered the kind of light comedy we see in Love Searches for an Apartment. And the spacious, elegant Femina mounted 10 plays in this genre. By the way, after the war, it reverted back to a movie house and was in existence all the way to 2014. Today, it's a giant supermarket, but a plaque near the entrance commemorates its use in the ghetto. Now, artistic creativity is celebrated in this film, of course, but so is romantic love, even in this hellish environment. We see the painful parting as Edmund escapes with his little sister, but without his sweetheart, Stefsha. Such excruciating farewells were also common when the ghetto was sealed, dividing lovers when one was Jewish and forced into confinement, the other was not and continued living outside the walls. But even for couples who remained together, love in the surreal universe of the ghetto was freighted with many challenges. First, there was the question of privacy. And the play within the film revolves around this near impossible situation of multiple young couples sharing a single room. Almost every personal account of intimacy in the ghetto speaks of the fleeting moments when lovers are alone and there is relative peace and quiet. Fleeting moments, the rarest of intervals when that happens. Now, if the path to making love was filled with obstacles, so was the road to finding love. This for a generation that came of age between the wars and was much more free thinking about sexuality than their traditional parents. Courtship, though, could not be the same as it was in the 1920s and 30s, when couples met in cafes and cabarets and restaurants, now enjoyed by just a few. And young people had deepened their relationships through leisurely strolls through Warsaw's inviting avenues and parks on spring and summer evenings. The blocks of the ghetto, though, were filled with misery. Famished beggars, desperate street vendors, disease, debilitation, everywhere. Hardly romantic. Let's look at the next image, please. An 18-year-old diarist, a bookish, assimilated Jew, in love for the first time, describes a day with her boyfriend. And here she is on the right. She is in her, she's maybe 16, 17 years old in the ghetto. The photo on the left, she is a leading author in post-war Poland, taken many years later. Look at this diary entry. There is nowhere to go, nowhere to be alone. The streets moan and yell with 1,000 voices. They reek of rotten fish and dying bodies. Wherever we turn, we look. Whatever we look at, it's ugliness. So we run away and hide from it all in the flat. Here, at least, we're safe from the sounds and smells. Not from other people, though. For a while, there was no one around, and Roman stroked my cheek and I stroked his. And we moved close to each other. But then Jadwiga suddenly opened her door and went to the loo and came back. Then Sophie went up and down. Then Heinrich came home. I could hardly bear it. So I asked Roman to go. My eyes filled with tears as I said it. Now let me pick up this story. As he left, her boyfriend Roman whispered in her ear that they could spend a night in the hotel. Expensive though it was, he had saved enough for that. And she ends her entry, this entry, thinking about it. But note the date, July 21st, 1942. The Great Deportation began the next day, and the two immediately went into hiding, but far apart. They would survive, but not see each other for years afterward. Okay, can remove that. Now, always hanging over the heads of lovers in the ghetto was the sense that time was very short. And this is a burden that usually doesn't weigh upon youth. For some, love was an all too brief respite from the suffering and dread are all around them. As one diarist put it, the narcotic with which we numb our fear. An Israeli scholar of the ghetto writes that whatever the emotional wellspring of sexual intimacy, despite its hasty, restless nature, the very fact that in this life or death struggle, people could still embrace love underscored their humanity and resilience. Now, let me conclude with this thought. Warsaw Ghetto, the Warsaw Jewry was trapped in a totalitarian cage. Some of those imprisoned went along with it they went along with it passively. And some profited from it shamelessly. But the film focuses on those who tried to escape or those even within captivity tried to carve out a measure of liberation for themselves and for others. Although set in a place known for the most spectacular armed revolt in modern Jewish history, the film shows us just about every other kind of defiance. Illegal border crossing and smuggling, underground publications and verbal dissent, humor and ridicule, art and music. And yes, love and sacrifice if we consider those forms of resistance. And in Warsaw, there's the determination of Ringelblum and his associates to document the regime's crimes, another rebellious act. So I see this as a timely movie because so many people today live in the grip of tyranny, and they seek ways to counter it. Thank you.
Fred, it's really, thank you so much. It's really an excellent, exquisite talk, and I've learned so much.
Thank you.
Everyone, you can think of your questions and write them in the chat function, which is located at the bottom of your screen. So let me ask you a question. If there's one book that you
Yeah,
can recommend about whether the Warsaw Ghetto or about Polish Jewry, what would you just one or two?
sure, sure. Well, I can't do just one, but I'll say a
Okay.
few in terms of this, what people might be interested in. So the best book on Ringelblum, who I mentioned at some length, is called Who Will Write Our History? And the author is Sam Kassow, Kassow. It's just so well written by someone who's an expert in the field. And he really gives the background of, well, the historian that I admire more than any other historian, Emanuel Ringelblum, because of the uses to which he put history and his dedication, what he did in the Warsaw Ghetto. So for that, so that's called Who Will Write Our History. Then, in terms of the diary, I gave you an excerpt of the diary of Chaim Kaplan, and that is just searing, you know. You see that he doesn't hesitate to even take on Jews, Jewish leadership that he thinks are not really serving the people. So the diary of Chaim Kaplan, I think, is really very, very important in this. Um, so those are two that I would start with. One is essentially a biography, and the other one is a diary.
If there aren't any questions, I know you you talked brilliantly and really covered uh, Polish Jewry and especially the Warsaw Ghetto. So I think people are just impressed by your talk. Really, it was an excellent,
Okay,
excellent talk, and
thank you.
I've heard, I think all of them. Uh, if there are any questions, we will say till your next talk
Okay, thank you.
sometime in the fall, I presume,
Right.
and we'll think of something for you to talk about. Thank
Okay,
you,
sure.
everyone,
Okay,
very, very much. If there
thank
aren't any
you.
questions, toda rabah, and
Okay,
we'll see you again sometime soon.
okay. Good night, folks.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
sure. Thank you. Bye bye now.